In this episode, special guest Dr. Jud Brewer, pioneering psychiatrist, neuroscientist, and New York Times best-selling author, returns to once again join the ongoing conversation featuring Shinzen Young, meditation teacher and neuroscience research consultant, Chelsey Fasano, a Columbia University neuroscience student, and Dr. J. Sanguinetti, Assistant Director for the Center for Consciousness Studies and Research Professor at the University of New Mexico. In this episode, the group take a deep dive into the concepts of the self, comparing and contrasting religious models with the latest theories in neuroscience and psychology. Shinzen rethinks early Buddhist craving and aversion doctrine in the light of modern mathematics. Jud considers the clinical implications of neuro-modulation and psychedelics. And the group discusses the typical learning curve to enlightenment, as well as the role of connection and communion in contemplative endeavours. So without further ado, Shinzen Young, Chelsey Fasano, Dr. J. Sanguinetti, and special guest, Dr. Jud Brewer. Shinzen Young, Chelsey Fasano, Dr. J. Sanguinetti, and special guest returning, Dr. Jud Brewer. Welcome back to the podcast.
Good to be here.
Thanks for having us.
Well, I'm so delighted that we're able to reconvene for a sequel. That episode we recorded previously, and of course I'll link that in the show notes, was just so fascinating. And as Jud put it towards the end of that episode, we'd really just begun to scratch the surface, having discussed all the very interesting work that everyone's been doing and has done, and the beginning to open up a dialogue and think really rather creatively about where all this might go and how all these things might interact. So fascinating. And now we're ready to dive deeper. And the person who's going to initiate that deep dive is Chelsey. So Chelsey, please, if you would.
So last time we talked, we covered so much amazing ground with all of your work, how it relates to each other, and also what kind of possibilities there are for the future of the world. And I think one of the big topics we're considering is what would it look like to democratize enlightenment and have many more people be experiencing these altered states of consciousness that used to be the property of long periods of practice that not everyone would have the privilege to do. And so I think an interesting jumping off point would be to think about practical applications for people right now. What are some of the ways that people can practically get to a state where there is less of their self involved in their moment-to-moment awareness? And to add a plot twist, what are we talking about when we talk about the self neurologically? And are there gradients of selfhood that can be sort of turned down with more or less ease for people, for ordinary people?
Mm-hmm. What a great question to start with. So I'll jump in. You know, I was heavily influenced by a review paper. This is over 10 years ago by Chin and Northoff. Georg Northoff has been thinking about the self for literally for a long time, decades. And they described looking at basically a review of literature, looking at self-referential processing. They kind of identified, a split, I would say, between two hubs of the default mode network. I know we talked a lot about the default mode network being the self-referential processing network. And they, if I remember correctly, they had this idea of the medial prefrontal cortex, one of those hubs, being more of a conceptual sense of self, kind of if I get up in the morning and I look in the mirror and I say, oh, that's Jud, there's a concept of Jud that can be updated or moment to moment and can feel continuous through time, but probably moment to moment updating, saying, oh yeah, Jud, that type of thing. And then the way that they conceptualize the second hub of the default mode network, the posterior cingulate, was more of an experiential sense of self. And that one in particular, and these two are probably pretty closely related, but looking at some of the research from the psychedelic literature and looking at some of the research that my own lab has done with neurophenomenologic experiments, where we looked at, what exactly is linking, the experience, somebody's subjective experience, with their brain activity, we've mostly looked at the posterior cingulate. So I can speak to that a little bit. And that seems to line up pretty well with Chin and Northoff's idea around an experiential sense of self. And I think we touched on this a little bit last time, but just as a refresher for anybody listening to this as the sequel or listening to this fresh, this experience of contraction versus expansion it seems to be a marker of experience, because we experience contraction, we experience expansion, whereas Jud is just a word. And so we can even start to feel into the difference between the concept of Jud and maybe Jay or Shinzen saying, Jud, that's a terrible idea, where I get a contraction around it, or Jud, that's a great idea, and I get a contraction around that because I'm excited. I'm like, oh, it's kind of ego boosting. And I get some my chest gets a little puffier, type of thing. But that can be experienced directly. And from from a pragmatic standpoint, the experiential sense of self, to me, might be a really good place with which to explore, the deconstruction of self and working with that, because it is something we all experience. So I'll throw it to Jay and Shinzen just in terms of that opening, volley, so to speak, or, that's one way of looking at self. Does that seem pragmatic, or are there other ways that we should be, or more important ones?
Jay, I would ask you, are you familiar with the study that Jud mentioned? And what's your take on it and what Jud just had to say?
Yeah, I am familiar because I read one of Jud's more recent papers that cites it, and I went back and read it after that.
Did
so
I
I'm
get it
familiar with
right? It was Chin and Nordhoff?
Yes, QIN
Yeah.
is the first author, and Northoff, I think it's Northoff.
So it's QIN, it's a Pinyin Chinese name, Chin.
Yes, correct.
Right. Yeah, I would agree overall with Judd's assessment and statement, and I would say, part of, I think, what is emerging from the science as you start looking for the networks of the self, for example, you're digging into the brain and you're trying to figure out, well, where is it? And what we're finding is that it's nowhere in one network, of course, but it also seems to be composed of component processes, or it's multi-dimensional is one way to think about it. And there's a really great paper by, I believe it's Robin Carhart Harris's group. He's one of the researchers looking into psychedelics and psychedelic interventions. And the postdoc in his lab, I can't remember the first author right now, but the paper is about sort of going from self-modulation and mindfulness and psychedelics and trying to build a general model of how self transforms through these different types of interventions. And they've got this great little graph. It's one of these phenomenology graphs where they show the different pieces of the self and how long-term versus short-term practice can sort of modulate different parts of the self. So for example, there's an embodied part of self. There is a part of the self that can kind of think into the future and think into the past, your sort of autonoetic or autobiographical self. There's all these different pieces, and different types of practices can modulate them in different ways, which in the clinic can be very useful if you know which piece of the self is being modulated. For example, if you have body trauma, you might want to take ketamine, which can give you a bit of a separation from the body, so you can do some work on that trauma. So, I think that this general idea that it's multidimensional and there's different pieces that all can be modulated in different ways is kind of becoming more of a accepted idea. And of course, this goes back to old philosophy texts 2,000 years ago that were looking for the sense of self and also parsing it out. So Aristotle and Socrates and Plato were also parsing the self into these different pieces.
I actually have a few of these diagrams readily available. I don't think they're by Carhart Harris, they're by Millier, but he offers a really interesting multidimensional model. If you want me to screen share, I can kind of quickly show the audience what we're sort of thinking visually, if that's helpful.
Please.
You'll have to verbally describe it for the people listening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right.
And as you pull it up, this reminds me of, going back to the ancient teachings, Richie Davidson, decade and a half ago, had talked at a Mind and Life Summer Research Institute about stickiness, and of course, as an addiction psychiatrist, stickiness to me, it has a lot to do with craving. And of course, craving is, is all over the suttas. And so I wonder if that piece of stickiness might even relate here to that experiential sense of self and contraction. Please, Chelsey.
Yes. So this chart right here shows, it's by Millier, who's a psychedelic researcher, but he shows how he identifies 6 different aspects here: body ownership, bodily awareness, self-location, phenomenal richness, access to semantic autobiographical information, and frequency of self-related thought. And then he shows how, depending on the variance of each of these things and how they're contracting or expanding, you would get a sort of different shape of self-largeness or self-smallness. Those probably aren't the most scientific words, but your self would contract and expand in different shapes depending on the experience. And I think that's a good model to talk about the sort of nuances of what we're talking about here. And there's others like this too, but I like the way he draws it into a kind of shape that's infinitely variable almost.
Just looking at that, looking at the body ownership, for example, I could see that being pretty much in line with this experiential sense of self. This is my body, this is me, versus, awareness, for example, and phenomenal richness. I think, if I remember the diagram correctly, could be those pieces around where there's really strong awareness. I think of it as, the more we take ownership over things, the more attached we are, the more identified we are, the more we take things personally, the more that becomes a smokescreen for phenomenological richness, because we are starting to see the world through certain lenses, the self, this me, and everybody has their own lenses. Yet the more that starts to dissolve, whether it's psychedelics or meditation or just tapping it, somebody can just tap into a flow state, just spontaneously. The more that happens, the more those glasses come off and that richness pops, I could see, as compared to these clouds or the glasses there in terms of the self. So here, just speaking, moving a little bit toward the pragmatics, I can see where the more we kind of get out of our own way, that experiential sense of self starts to dissolve, the more that richness starts to come through. It's like the clouds part and the sun's shining through, which I think speaks, is very much in line with at least the Buddhist teachings that I'm aware of. Whereas, it's like selflessness, we're all enlightened all the time. It's just a matter of realizing it. But I'm curious what Shinzen and Jay think of that.
Jay?
Yeah, I think it gets to this fundamental question. If you have all these different functional pieces that are integrating into the experiential self, and you can understand those as different component processes across the brain, across networks, it's a lot of energy and information that needs to be integrated into what is probably an illusion of the self and not an actual physical thing in there that has a solidity to it. It makes sense then, if you were to soften, cool down some of the preference for that process, that the availability of less solidity, I guess is one way to think about it, would gives you that sort of elevated feeling of the availability of whatever's present without having to go through all that process. And one way to think about that is it's less separation, more getting you closer to the input, to the sensory input. And we've talked a lot on the previous calls, which I'm sure you haven't had time to listen to, Jud, because there's about 5 or 6 of them, but been trying to figure out why does that, once you get away from the asynchrony of the brain process, meaning the brain is processing asynchronously from the environment, and once you can sort of synchronize your sensory systems with the sensory input and get a lot of the sort of self stuff out of the way, why does that tend to feel so good within the right context? And I think that's one of Chelsey's main questions. And I think you hit on it. You're sort of getting some of that pushing away from the sensory input away, and it's just giving you the availability of that good feeling.
Yeah, well, it's a lot of work to push away and hold on to things.
It takes a lot. it feels asynchronous, and that asynchrony, I think is really, where we're living most of the time.
I was just going to quickly add,
go ahead.
Sorry.
Yeah.
We did a literature review on this concept you're talking about, Dr. Brewer, about the phenomenological richness increasing as the self decreases, because I was looking into evidence for Shinzen's element sensory clarity. And we did find a very small but convincing body of research showing that people do actually have differences in sensory processing that happen in advanced stages of meditation that correspond to an objective increase in their ability to evaluate sensory stimuli, something like a line being shorter or longer, right? So there is an objective truth to the fact that we actually are seeing the world more clearly, quite literally. And it would be something like what Shinzen talks about with this HD awareness, right? We're actually getting more pixels, so to speak. So that is a fact. And I think what's interesting about your work and what I really love about it with the idea of clinging is that if we were to cling to almost anything, including the self, which is a main thing that people cling to, it would cause a sort of perceptual narrowing and inattentional blindness to all of the other things occurring in reality, right? So it may not be that we need to get rid of the self, but rather if we stop clinging to it, we can broaden our ability to pay attention to more than just that. And as Shinzen talks about, it becomes super conductive, right? So it might not be as clear cut as killing the ego, but rather just simply widening out and letting go of the ego processes as they occur and allowing them to be more fluid.
A couple things come to mind based on the ideas we've thrown around so far. So one thing is, we've talked about the notion that self can be multidimensional. That's a very important notion. In mathematics, there's a generalization of a normal number. A normal number would be called a scalar value. So you can generalize that to numbers that have arbitrary dimensions, 3-dimensional, 4-dimensional, what have you, and those are called vectors. And vectors and their transforms are what constitute the field of math called linear algebra, which almost every science student has to take. So the notion that there can be components or parts or independent dimensions of some sort, I think is very grounded in science. And it's also very grounded in early Buddhism. Buddhism makes a big deal about divide and conquer and the power that comes when you take something that seems like a gamish and tease out the independent components that are there. So I would say this is a theme that spans both the ancient world and the modern world. The theme of, okay, let's take this complicated thing and maybe we can view it from some angle and suddenly it's not so complicated. It's just really 3 dimensions, 3 degrees of freedom, what have you. So in the West, it was applied in math and then eventually in physical science with actually the development of calculus and pre-calculus. Basically takes this notion from math and then says we can divide and conquer in the real world. We can see physical systems like forces, what have you, as vector fields, functions of space-time. So in the West, the notion of dimensionality was very successful in early math among the Greeks. And then when math exploded with Newton and Leibniz and the development of calculus, although it had Asian predecessors with Secchi and the South Indian schools, but we think about Newton and Leibniz, sort of created a new kind of math with calculus. So with this view of math, we're now looking at not just the mathematical independent components, which is the analysis into primes that Euclid achieved, but now the physical world can be analyzed into components. And from that, well, maybe the subjective experience can also be analyzed into components. So this vector way of thinking has been very rich in the West with science. But what the Buddha did, or at least what early Buddhism did, it's a little hard to actually know what the historical Buddha himself taught, but we have a reflection certainly of early Buddhism in the Pali scriptures. And there, this notion is very central. And it's expressed in various ways. Sometimes the five elements are the dimensions are the five aggregates. There's just these aggregates, and when you stop clinging to them, the problems all go away. Sometimes it's the four great elements. With regards to the body, there's just earth, water, air, fire, qualities, and when you deconstruct it that way, the somethingness of body self goes away. That's another break it into components way of working. Or the four foundations of mindfulness could be viewed as different components of self, sensorially speaking. So early Buddhism does it with the sense of self, and the it is say, okay, there's a dimensionality here, and we're going to utilize that to get understanding and empowerment. So this is just a quick review of this whole notion, just to sort of put some icing on the cake. There's a lot of inaccurate quotes from Einstein on the internet, many. Some of them relating to Buddhism that I wish were true, but aren't. But in any event, one thing we know he definitely did say, because we've got it in the original German, I think it's called Meine Weltbild or something like that, and it was translated into English, My View of the World, something like that. And Einstein did say the worth of a human being is measured by the sense in which and the degree to which they have transcended their small identity. That is an actual quote. Well, he's sort of saying the whole ego grasping thing should be looked upon vectorially, right? Sense and magnitude. This is a vector space. So call it axial thinking, call it divide and conquer, call it dimensionality, call it finding atoms, or the canonical eigen basis of the system. These are all ways of saying the same thing. It's been enormously productive, East and West, ancient and modern. So I just wanted to chime in on that theme and then say, I think it's going to be helpful to make some distinctions. This vector, or let's look at the components kind of approach, can be applied on one hand to the biological system that is the brain. Call it neural correlates, call it
Neurophenomenology.
phenomenology, call it what you want, but the brain's doing things, and we can use SI units and standard mathematics to model what the brain is doing. And we can try to analyze that in terms of components. This region dances with this region and this region in this way at this time to this effect. But we're really talking about, of course, Jay said it, and I like the juxtaposition, energy and information as a function of space-time. That's what we're talking about. So there's what the brain is doing, and we can analyze that into components. Then there is the subjective report of a practitioner. And depending on what the conceptual framework of their practice system is, they may or may not be set up to give you a report of their sensory experience of self based on a system that they are practicing. Now, one of the things that characterizes the system is that people that use our system can do that. If you ask them to describe their experience of self, they can do it in terms of mental image, mental talk, emotional body sensations, perhaps also including physical body, and therefore anything in the body. But they will be able to analyze it into 3 or 4 basic components that way and tell you in real time the relative intensity and the relative degree of push and pull versus fluidity and so forth. Now, that's of course, I built dimensionality into my system intentionally so that we could take subjective reports and know that people are on pretty much the same page. So early Buddhism has a number of dimensional analyses, either explicit or implicit, confusingly different. The people that wrote those analyses are no longer living. Different modern traditions, unfortunately, confusingly give different interpretations of some of that. Try, for example, to get enlightenment using the 5 aggregates. Everyone talks about it as part of scholastic Buddhism. How do you set up a meditation system based on that? Well, you can do it. I've actually done it as an experiment, but it's pretty counterintuitive and not easy to do. On the other hand, mental image, mental talk, and emotional body sensation, that's only 3 things. And people can learn to track those pretty well. So that's dimensionality implemented for a subjective report. Then there's that nice radar chart. I guess that's what that's called. That is that right, Jay? That kind of diagram.
Yeah, radar chart's one term.
What's the other? There's a better term.
I can't remember. I call them radar charts.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's what we'll call it then. So that's someone's idea about how the self should be organized. And sure, they're trying to relate it to phenomenology as experienced and the neuroscience as hypothesized. But it's still, I put that kind of dimensional analysis into the philosophy category. Not to denigrate it, it's just sort of speculative. Now, the name of the game here, I would think, would be to get an alignment between those three domains. The subjective reports are dimensional, and the brain science is dimensional. And then we link those and make the philosophy and the theory somehow. But I do believe that they are different critters. The way we're philosophizing about these regions and what we see just in the physicality of the brain, and then what a expert or non-expert, trained or not trained in an ontology of self, would report as their subjective experience. These are three different domains. They're all amenable to the dimensionality approach. And I would think we would try to get this lined up somehow.
I could see it. I agree with the importance of lining these things up, and also, as what was the quote from Winnie the Pooh? I'm a bear of very little brain. Some big words, bother me, or something like that. Keeping things simple as a clinician, wanting to be able to help my patients, and really trying to distill it down to the essence of what might be pragmatically helpful for them in terms of what would one dimension be, for example, for them to zoom in on, kind of get calibrated around, and then be able to go home and practice, where this is where I could see, I think a lot of the work with the psychedelics has pointed to this. I'm guessing the work that you all have done points to this as well. And certainly some of the research that my lab has done is congruent with it, at least, where looking at this aspect of this dimension of open and closed, for example, I think we've spoken about this before, that is a relatively simple language and relatively straightforward for somebody to tap into. I see the psychedelics helping people see how far the spectrum can be on one end when they look into open. Flow is the same way. If somebody hasn't experienced flow or hasn't had experience with psychedelics, they might not know how open their experience can actually be, kind of opening up that aspect of self with it's like the clouds are parting so much that it's a super sunny sky, so to speak, with the analogy there. So I'm wondering how one might zoom in on that dimension, if that is one dimension to zoom in onto. And as a behavioral neuroscientist, I always think about, how does the brain learn? It learns through reward-based learning. Most, 99% of what we learn is through that. And so have you learned anything from your work? So this could even be the work with meditators and helping them develop that clarity in being able to see experience clearly, zoom in on clinging, for example, as an aspect of contraction, or just lining up those words. And even work that you've done with the ultrasound that might help people see how rewarding it is to kind of put down that mantle or put down that heavy burden of the experience of self as they open to experience.
Yeah,
I also
think,
wonder, sorry,
go ahead.
Jay. I was just going to add to this, what I'm thinking as you two are talking is that there's one thing is having the experience of letting go of the self or feeling more open or more in flow. And the other thing is identifying that you've had it. And so if people aren't given some mechanism with which to do that, they might actually be having these experiences already. And there's definitely teachers that argue that people are just in, breastfeeding their child or making love or watching a sunset or any of these other things that happen in a human life, but just not have thought about it in that particular way. So there's like the calibration to one's own experience issue that's interesting to think about as we're talking about this.
Yeah, I think that's really insightful. That in the lab, we call that the scaffold of the new self. So you've got this old self that has developed over, in my case, 38 years, that's functionally very helpful to have to navigate the world. but it has maybe developed some unhealthy habits that, although help me act in the world in a way that's getting the job done, maybe it's not the most skillful way to be in the world, and it's also causing a lot of trouble. So that's the current sort of, self skyscraper that I built. And so now you have these new experiences that don't quite fit into that scaffold, and they sort of float in this, weird space of human experience. You take a psychedelic, for example, you get this opening, but it doesn't quite fit into the brain, and learning systems don't know how to quite fit that into action in the world. And so the scaffold, the sort of cognitive framework to even understand, what is equanimity, or what is clinging and aversion, and how does that relate to how I currently understand myself, I think is tapping into what Jud's talking about. You have to learn how to fit that into a new model that helps you navigate the world. And that is exactly what some of the early subjects have reported in our studies. So in the last podcast, we talked about how we're targeting the posterior cingulate, which is a part of the brain that we targeted specifically because of some of Jud's awesome papers. And in those studies, some of our early subjects are non-meditators. So they don't have a meditation scaffold. They don't have any kind of framework for thinking about equanimity or stickiness, any of the looseness that can happen in these networks of the self that we're talking about. And the reports that they will have will be things like, my thoughts are less stuck. They don't have the words for it, but they'll say, like, specifically in my thought space, the thought will come and go. And we're sort of asking them these phenomenology questions like, well, what is that like for you? And they're like, well, I guess that's pretty nice. Right? So they're not even tuning in really to the valence of it so much, because it's just a study. They're sitting in the MRI, they're getting paid. They're not being told about meditation or enlightenment or any of these things that some of us might be interested in. They're just being told, this is a study about the default mode network and a change. So, without that scaffold, they can have these interesting experiences that then later on, when we tell them, the hypothesis of the study, so at the end of our study, we tell people what we're trying to do, then they say, oh, I've heard about that. I've heard about meditation. And we've actually had some participants say, maybe I should go meditate. And actually, some of our participants have started meditating. So as soon as they got that little scaffold, they can fit that experience into it. And, that's part of the integration piece, I think, that we were talking about last time, that, you can keep doing these interventions into these states, but if you don't have a way to rebuild that into a new learning system, a new self that has learned from that, they get just kind of stored off in the weird part of brain experience. The other,
go ahead.
The other thing, sort of off of what you said, Shinzen, and to Jud's question, it sounds like if there is this multidimensional breakdown in systems that get reintegrated into the self, then there likely is this stickiness process, this expansion contraction process that you were describing, Jud, in each of those systems. And even as I say that, having this self that feels very solid, I feel like there's a graspiness to it, and it's one-dimensional. Like the self is grasping and the self pushes away from pain. And that's basically how it works from my experience. But it looks like from our studies, when we're targeting into these systems like the default mode network, it looks like we can give a little bit of unstickiness to one little piece of the self, which is the part of the self that thinks about the past and the future, for example. And if we target a different piece of the network, it looks like we can give that less stickiness to the body piece of the self. And so people will have the same amount of stickiness to their negative thoughts or whatever, but now they're sort of loose in the body dimension. And so I don't know if that matches some of the old Buddhist ideas.
That would be huge if we see a statistical pattern like that. Let me just repeat what you're saying to make sure I understand. You're suggesting that the unsticking, and I'm just going to use the term from unified mindfulness, flow, which in this case just means that the experience is less solid. It's different from flow as used in positive psychology. So in the system, our proxy term for what in Buddhism is called impermanence, and what in East Asian medicine and martial arts is called qi, qi. I just call that flow to have a name for it, because it's fluidity. And it's a pretty good proxy for equanimity. Things do tend to phenomenologically become more fluid when there's, well, less coagulation, right? So one issue is the stickiness or the grasping or the identification one thing, or is it two different things? One of the two things called craving and the other one called aversion, because early Buddhism has a model that there are three habits that get in the way: raga, dvesha, moha. Now, these are often translated in English as greed, hatred, and delusion, which is poetic and dramatic and gets people's attention, but may not be the better scientific meaning of the term. If craving is a holding on of something that's trying to pass, and aversion is a interference with something that's trying to arise, then really this is just one thing. It's a push and pull, or something analogous to viscosity. I didn't say it is viscosity. Analogous to viscosity, friction, impedance, or even perhaps turbulence. I'm saying analogous, not necessarily the same physical system. So if it's now, you take someone like Sasaki Roshi, who, as far as liberation goes, was probably as liberated as any human I ever interacted with. But his whole thing was not about craving and aversion from early Buddhism. He simplified it to not fixating the self, jiko kote suru. So his whole thing was, all you got to do is understand how the self arises and not fixate it. And he would describe to you how it arises, and then task you with not fixating it. So one thing that is just an issue to think about, since we're so influenced in the neuroscience field by the Buddhist formulations, and there's good reason for that, because that's the most systematic and historically the best preserved of all the world's practice systems. The other practice systems are not well preserved or weren't as systematic or proto-scientific as Buddhism. So there's a reason we're very influenced by Buddhism. But do we want to say that there's two things, craving and aversion, that we're letting go of? Or do we want to simplify it and say there's really just one thing? As a positive quality, we would call it equanimity. From a negative point of view, what it's an absence of is absence of self-interference. And by self, I mean the sensory system in some way fighting with itself, operating in a way that's not good from the viewpoint of efficient energy and information flow. So is it really one thing that we're talking about? Or do we want to go more Buddhist and say it's about craving and aversion? See, I found Sasaki Roshi's way of talking about this whole thing to be very interesting, because if it's really about unfixating the perception of self when it arises, and that would be something that you create by practice, but at the same time, he says, it's also about discovering that the deeper levels of processing have no such push and pull on them. They're already in a perfect fluid state. The push and pull comes later. So it's both, there's a training effect. You learn not to fixate the self when it arises, but there's also a discovery effect, which is also training. You discover that at the instant of the arising of every see, hear, feel, think, speak, move, there's no craving and aversion, there's no push and pull at all. It's just effortless entropy and free energy, presumably dancing together, a la Friston. So if we take that model, that's sort of interesting, because now it's starting to sound like some sort of physical property, like a Reynolds number, a parameter of a system of differential equations, which if you cross a certain critical threshold, you'll get a phase change. So in order to make that real, I think we need to have a good way to link the subjective reports with the objective neural phenomenology. So for example, this gets back to what you mentioned, that Jay, I said this would be a big thing if we can do it. Are we seeing a pattern that the loosening up seems to occur in different aspects of self, depending on where we sonicate? Are we that fine-grained enough, or do you think we could get that fine-grained?
It at least seems to be a pattern in the phenomenological reports. So people aren't specifically relating it back to self qua self, but they are saying this piece of my experience has loosened, and it's sticky. It's really around the term sticking. Love Jud's term, because that's really when people don't have a framework for it. They just say, yeah, I got a little pain, but it just wasn't sticking around. It's just going away. And then when you say, well, how is that? Oh, that's kind of great, actually. And then they say, wait a minute, is that a possibility? That's almost always the chain of things for people. So it often comes back to like, is this a thing that myself can do over time?
See,
but it definitely seems like it's in the different networks for sure. We're getting different pieces of the phenomenology. Now, of course, it's really hard to study that, and we need people like Jud to help us figure out how do you ask the right questions about phenomenology.
Well, one thing that I have always wanted to parse out and never been able to do in any lab that I was associated with, and maybe the science is good enough now, and because of the people we're working with, Tim and so forth, his neuropipe. But if someone comes to me or one of our coaches that's a senior coach and says, I want stream entry, that's a goal in my practice, I'm going to say, great, it's good to want that. You can go about that in a lot of different ways, but I have a standard way that I like to start, and we'll see what happens. I'm going to give you a technique called see, hear, feel in, and I'm going to have you monitor moment by moment whether you have visual thought or not, whether you have mental talk or not, whether you have body sensation that is obvious to you in that moment to be emotional in nature or not. That's three binary variables. We're obviously making a binary approximation. It's going to be some sort of sigmoid or continuum of some sort, but we're saying just for simplicity's sake. And now I'm going to claim that they're monitoring the core sensory elements that activate when we have a sense of self. And what I'd like to see is, originally I had thought it would be interesting if we could monitor, as people reported, see here, all, here, see here. If we could actually get differentially what that looks like, as they're saying, and then rest would be if the whole system goes inactive spontaneously. So I had always thought it would be cool to be able to monitor, to connect what any experienced practitioner can do, reporting real-time activation in this inner system. If we could ever link that to reliably to neurophenomenology, that would be great. But now what you're saying, Jay, is quite independent of that. We may notice what I'm going to interpret as equanimity. The non-stickiness is equanimity. You're saying we may be able to differentiate the equanimity impact of the ultrasound in different subsystems of the default, or of the PCC itself, or subsystems of the broader network. Which one
it's
we're talking
broader
about?
networks.
The broader network.
We tried default mode network. We've tried the sort of cognitive end of the basal ganglia, prefrontal loop. So these would be roughly corresponding to that radar plot that Chelsey showed with the different components.
So that's a whole other way we might bring dimensionality in. If we could, and if it's the same effect, which it does seem to be, it seems to induce equanimity, which is important, because if equanimity covers both craving and aversion, now all you need is the right direction of clarity to get the insight into no self. And typically that happens through two mechanisms. One is the untangling of the elements so they don't qualitatively cross-multiply, producing the perception of somethingness. That's, I believe, how the somethingness goes away. And then the second mechanism is the equanimity, the non-graspingness, which is actually the radical permission for the inner system to activate. Ironically, it's when you so unblock the selfing that it's just the verb called selfing and doesn't coagulate into a reified thinging. That's one of the ways that people experience stream entry, is when you get a full Monty of the inner system, full level of activation, and you notice it arising from beginning to end, and you don't coagulate around it. That's one of the ways that people get set free. So couple mechanisms probably enter in. a clarity that leads to an anti-emergence. Not every emergent property is a good thing. The property self is a thing is actually useful sometimes and useful to be able to get a vacation from a lot of the other time. So
I don't mean to jump in, but there's this image that's coming up, Shinzen, and I want to see if this fits with what you're describing. Going back to this, your question around, craving and aversion is separate or, can be brought together as a single entity. This image of kind of creating an ice cube out of water comes to mind. And when we crave, when we hold on to things, when we push things away, we're adding energy to the system, kind of like putting water in a freezer. Say we live in Arizona and we have to add a lot of energy to the system to make ice where it's hot outside. And so we're adding energy to the system just as a habitual process where the mind somehow has gotten this idea that selfing is a good, that clinging, that holding on to things and pushing away things is helpful, because we've been reinforced in certain ways to do that. So there I could see, that ice cube, whether we're holding on to it or pushing it away, doesn't matter. We're still adding energy to the system. So I think that, if I'm understanding correctly, that seems to fit with what you're talking about around, it could be two things. It could be one thing. They're both related. But here also, the way you're describing equanimity and also the system that you use to help people move towards stream entry is kind of, adding, so we could think of it as adding energy to a system, like adding a heat source to the ice cube where we are melting the ice, taking that energy, and instead of trying to make the ice colder or make it, lower temperature, we're actually adding energy to the system and allowing that system to thaw out and then become fluid again. And then when it's totally fluid, I think of that as equanimity, because you can't, you can push, you can throw an ice cube, you can hold on to an ice cube, but water just flows out of your hand. And there too, I wonder if I'm probably taking this analogy too far, but I'm going to keep going, is seeing that the ice will melt itself simply through awareness. So we could bring that heat source in through the noting practice or through your practice, where it helps, it reminds me of the observer effect in physics, right? By observing, you're affecting the result. In psychology, I see the same thing. Using these practices, it helps people gain some perspective and some distance and not be as identified with their thoughts and their emotions. And that in itself is joyful. I think, as Jay is talking about, that lack of stickiness actually feels pretty darn good. And when we see that it feels pretty darn good, we can realize that we don't actually have to add the heat source to it, and we can just simply rest in awareness, and that darn block of ice will melt on its own. And I wonder if that melting process, as it starts melting on its own, and we realize that we can just be, be in awareness of it. I don't know where that would fit within the realm of pre or post stream entry or along the spectrum. It probably doesn't even matter. But just the letting go of not having to add energy to the system, first with not making the thing colder, right? Adding tons of energy there. Second, not having to add energy to try to melt the ice. And third, just seeing that awareness itself, may be joyful enough, and the not having to do anything is the ultimate form of of joy, where it's like, oh, we put down the burden. So I don't know, I don't know if that analogy works, but that's just what comes up in listening to what you're saying.
Well, I think that thinking of these things in terms of some sort of phase change is scientifically a good way to think about it. If we can make it work that way, if we can make it analogous to a phase change. I would say timing, in my experience, is very important. I know that sounds completely abstract. What the hell does that mean? Well, let me put it into context. So let's say that a person starts with this see, hear, feel in technique. So they're going to observe moment by moment the level of activation of visual thought, auditory thought, and body emotion. So initially, there's a pretty, or I'm not going to say initially, broadly, there's a pretty predictable arc that people will go through with an approach like this. The first is to claim it, or to say, this doesn't feel like meditation. I did mantra, I visualized, I looked at a candle flame, I visualized world peace, I counted my breath. It took me into a certain state. What you're asking me to do here, noting, see, hear, feel, perhaps speaking even the words out loud, this isn't meditation. That's usually the first reaction. Because it takes a little while to learn how to track things like this. So no, initially you may not drop as deep, but there's a learning curve. And at some point it's like, oh, the noting process sort of goes on autopilot, and you can get a sense that you're dropping into a deep state, even though you're really clearly and in a very fine-grained way monitoring your sensory experience. So more and more that ability to monitor sort of becomes habitual, like driving a car. At first you have to think about every little thing. At some point you just get in and driving happens. So I'm giving you sort of a typical learning curve. Then there's often some confusion because sometimes you have a thought and it doesn't seem to be a mental image or mental talk. It just sort of pops into existence fully formed, and I can't parse it with those categories. And then there's other confusions that people typically have, but you sort of get over that and get over some of those awkward questions about the technique. And then what starts to happen is that the surface activity becomes much less in the inner system, but it's still there. It's much more fluid, but you're still thinking, you're still having emotions. But now you start to notice, before you get the surface awareness, there's a kind of stirring at your mental screen before you get the surface image, fleeting though it may be, of the person, place, object, memory, plan, fantasy scene, what have you. It's like there's a kind of stirring on the screen, and then there's an image. There's a kind of stirring in mental talk space, and then there's some mental talk. And then you start to notice, before that stirring, there's a tug to image space, the place where I would look to find an image. Just the tug of the space. There's a tug to talk space. There's a tug to the body space before I've felt anything at all. And you realize that those tugs are the beginning of the next actual round of processing in sensory or expression circuits. And you don't need to know what it is, because you know when it is. That's a moment of arising. I give it permission to flow in the depths without needing to know it or control it. That's now pointing you to the fact that the depths, without needing any surface knowing or controlling, are handling 99.9% of every goddamn thing that has to be handled perfectly thanks to 2 billion plus years of terrestrial evolution. It's all there in those circuits. And this is now pointing you through a tangible series of experiences that people will statistically tend to pass through over a period of a number of years, to where, oh, I do see that it's always primordially complete. But what I'm describing is an actual tangible sequence that we can algorithmically lead a person through over a period of many years of practice.
Yeah. So this makes me think, we were talking a lot about the individual self, and I'm wondering if this can even start to relate to selves relating to each other. So sorry to continue with the ice cube analogy, but the ice cubes you can think of them as individual ice cubes. And as they start to melt, they might start to flow into each other. And so they might start to lose their differentiation. So I'm curious, and I don't know, Chelsey, if there's a place that you want to start here, but I'm wondering if we could explore what that's like so we're exploring this dissolving or the loosening or the moving, the phase shift of the individual self, and starting to move into more fluidity where we flow together, and there might be consciousness that is less confined to one ice cube, so to speak. But I'm wondering if that might be a place to explore for a few minutes, like what that might look like as as we all use Shinzen system, for example, to start to melt these cubes.
I have thoughts on this topic, as you all know. Todd Mertz, who is Shinzen's community manager for many years, and I sometimes ponder the idea of adding an extra C onto the CCE paradigm. And we had talked about it being communion. Jay brought up the fact that connection would also work. But in my view, this extra C wouldn't be simply another element equal to CCE, but would be something like a two-bodied CCE experience. And I was reading your article, Jud, about, let's see what the official title is, because it's quite long, but beautiful. Feeling is believing. Go on, Jay.
I was going to say, maybe you want to define CCE really quickly.
Oh yeah, sorry. Concentration, clarity, and equanimity. So we could say that connection or communion is applying concentration, clarity, and equanimity to something outside of yourself that has its own volitional activity, right? Whether that's an animal or nature or a friend or a community or a partner, it would inherently be different from doing clarity, connection. I'm substituting in my own C. Concentration, clarity, and equanimity only on yourself, because there's another system involved. So I think often about, if you all succeed and this project goes forward of giving people more access to these states of self-dissolution, how that will actually impact dyads and communities and what that will look like. And I was reading your article, Dr. Brewer, Feeling is Believing, the Convergence of Buddhist Theory and Modern Scientific Evidence Supporting How Self is Formed and Perpetuated Through Feeling Tone. And in it, you use an example about cigarette smoking and how through this process of habituation and operant conditioning, we come to expect that some activity will make us feel a certain way. And we develop a sort of inattentional blindness and perceptual narrowing, so that we just expect the cigarette to do a certain thing. And the more we expect that, the less attuned we are to the richness of our experience. And my immediate thought when I read this is, well, what about when we do that to each other? When the cigarette is another person and we're expecting them to appear in a certain way over and over, so that we actually become blind to the fact that they are a fluctuating process of becoming. And so I started thinking about what would happen if everyone was experiencing these things that you all want them to experience, and what relationships would begin to look like. I don't know if that's helpful, or I hope so.
I love it. Well, I'll just say one little thing, because I've been speaking a lot, and I'd love to hear what Jay and Shinzen have to say, but it makes me think of, we create our perceptual and expectational habits of others. It's like if I have a life partner and I see them in a certain way, when they do something that is not expected, my brain gets an error term that says not, that was a prediction error. It's not what I predicted. And what do our brains do? They contract around that. No, you should have done this. And so could that even start to help us open to, one, not being so reactive to not just our partners, that's an example, but to our neighbors, to everyone, but also help us start to naturally develop compassion for others, because we are the ones creating our own suffering by expecting people to act a certain way, and then when they don't, we get angry because of our own expectations, not necessarily because of what they did. So there's a piece there. Like, does this even apply to to develop the natural development of compassion simply through clear seeing? But does it also apply to starting to just see the beautiful fluidity of life, and how we can just put down the burden of all of this, of expectation, and then see what happens? Do we naturally start to connect more with others the less we expect of them? And then on and on, because I could see kindness, I could see deep, rich connection happening naturally, because it just feels good when we put down our expectations. So that's just what immediately comes to mind, but I'm curious what other folks think.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great reflection. And, I think what comes to mind for me in thinking about this bigger topic of interventions that can fundamentally phase shift the sense of self. And I often get the question asked to me and about the work with Shinzen is, well, what if you have a brain zapper and you can just zap away the self? Is that what you're trying to do? The answer is always, of course, no, because that would not be a functional way to be humans in the world. And, if we could just scale out a device to 7 billion people that brain zapped away their sense of self, the whole thing would fall apart. I think we can predict that pretty easily. And so, when I'm thinking, Jud, about your analogy, let's just take it all the way in. If you have a device or a psychedelic that can show a person that they are the ice cube, they are the water, they are all the processes that compose all of that. Again, if you don't have a scaffold to even understand how that relates to you in the world, and what does that mean for you? You've had this whole model of separation and function, and suffering is good. Suffering has helped me learn from the world. You have all these notions around that. Now all of a sudden you get this phase shift. Your perspective shifts, 180 or 360 degrees, whatever it is. And you say, oh, wait a minute, I am the ice cube. Like, what do I do now? And I think there's a big gap for the nervous system between all the habits that have formed in the circuitry that have helped you act in the world in a certain way to survive, and the conscious phase shift of, I am the ice cube and everyone's the ice cube. Holy crap, what do I do with that? And there's a lot of training that needs to happen in between to get a new human being that can have that type of knowledge, whatever that really is, the true self, the true knowledge, in a functionally actionable way in the world. And that's where I think I really like the Buddhist term of skillful action, because from a reductionist neuroscience point of view, the whole goal of the system is to figure out what to do in the world, specifically to spread the genes and promote the agenda of the animal. And so it really comes down to that question of action. And now we have this very sophisticated sense of self thing that's trying to organize all of the sensory inputs and high-level goals and low-level goals, and trying to get the hierarchy of needs all lined up so you can be self-actualized and go out in the world and save the world, or whatever you're trying to do. And now you're talking about this huge phase shift, and you need that container, that new container to put it in. And so Chelsey, I think that sort of getting back to your question of how do you be a thing in the world that's got this phase shift, interacting with other things in the world, other people in the world that may not have that, and you're trying to navigate that. And probably the answer is you just need to develop some other skills to make that thing work. And we may be able to help that along. You know, that's kind of the goal in the lab. And I think a goal of a lot of the psychedelic research is to help that system learn a little faster how to update the model or undo the model or whatever actually is happening underneath the surface.
We talk about accelerating the process of mindfulness training from the viewpoint of neuromodulation. And I would include under that the resurgence of psychedelic research. There's a lot of interesting molecules out there that are being approached maturely now. That's all on a continuum. So there's what we can do perhaps at the molecular level or with non-invasive, but very precise neuromodulation. What we can do to speed up, accelerate, meaning not make it easy and fast, but make it easier and faster. But not too easy or too fast that it doesn't work for you. And then the other thing that we are looking into is AI to automate the support. So whenever we bring up things like neuromodulation or AI, there's a standard list of yabbas, yeah buts, objections that people have that we know they're going to say. It's absolutely predictable. For AI, they're going to say this, this, and this. For neuromodulation, they're going to say this, this, and this. And so I think one of the important things that anyone who is doing scientific research on things like meditation, particularly anyone who might be doing something practical and translational, like can we make this more available to people? I think there's two concepts that are not talked about much, and one concept that is talked about, and the above is in the psychedelic literature. And the two concepts that aren't talked about are very, very important. And they're our answer to some of the objections that people have to, well, you're just trying to zap someone's brain and, you know, induce artificial enlightenment, or like something like that. So the two concepts, and we have a name for them, are integration and conceptual framework. So once again, just to speak to the system that I created, and I know what's in it because I intentionally put these elements in it for these reasons. In the system, we don't just give you a bunch of techniques and a vague sort of breathe and smile and know that you're okay and whatever. We have this very elaborate framework: develop the skills, optimize the happiness. Here's what the skills are. Here's how you develop them. Here's the mechanism whereby these skills actually do optimize 20 independent dimensions of human happiness. So people have a very motivating framework of understanding what they're doing, how it all fits together. And one of the criticisms that we sometimes get of our apps is, well, they seem like a class in school. Yeah, they're supposed to be a class. They're supposed to give you a framework, because I think that's very important. And as Jay mentioned, when people get high or have other things that happen with, for whatever reason, even get spontaneous stream entry experiences, but that latch and stick, they're in the no self, they're in the oneness. If they don't have a framework, hopefully they'll get one. It used to be in the old days, there wasn't dozens and dozens of people on the internet who have had spontaneous enlightenment experiences without meditation. So you were often lost. Now, at least you can go to the internet and find other people. You know, you have a framework. So I think the framework is very important, and the conceptual framework in creating a system that is effective for people. And how you provide someone with a framework for psychedelic experiences and so forth, well, that's an issue. The second thing is something we call integration. It's what Jay just mentioned. It's the degree to which those altered states are, number one, traits. So you can just access them in daily life on demand. But number two, and this is where the main integration action is, to what extent are you able to utilize those altered states, call it oneness, emptiness, call it what you want, to what extent are you able to utilize them to have a life that is humanly fulfilling and objectively efficacious? That requires training, systematic training, extended training. So I think what's not being mentioned enough in some of the literature about no self and psychedelics is the importance of a good framework that they can grow with, and the importance of integrating these altered states, I repeat, into what is a life that is fulfilled in the normal human sense of fulfilled, and admirable in terms of actions in the world. You were loved in life and missed in death. You're that kind of human. And you used what is not human to help you achieve that extraordinariness of humanity. The thing that is mentioned increasingly, I think, in the psychedelic literature that is getting Jay and I's attention is the notion of anti-fragility. I think that that's a good notion, and maybe we don't have to get into that now, but I'm going to claim that what we call equanimity would be a primary example of an anti-fragility, a skill such that when the going gets tough, the tough get going.
So I'm wondering if, just to start to bring this all full circle and together, you know, the fragility, I think of an ice sculpture being a lot more fragile than a bucket of water. If you drop the ice sculpture on the floor, it does something very different than if you dump the bucket of water on the floor. So I'm wondering if this is a good place for us to start kind of thinking about this from, you know, we started with this concept of self and starting to just appreciate the complexity of the different elements through the radar plots and whatnot. And also starting to zoom in on, you know, which part of the system we might specifically target to, one, provide the education like you're talking about, Shinzen, where we help people see how painful it is to hold on, where we help people see how painful it is to push things away, just to see how much energy they're adding to the system to make that ice colder and more rigid, more fragile even. And then bring in I could even bring in baseline assessments where we could see where somebody is holding on or pushing away in particular. Is it an embodied element? Is it an emotional element? Is it a thought element? And bring in your ultrasound as a way to start melting the ice in a way that people can see, oh, this ice can be melted. Oh, it actually feels better to melt the ice than to add energy in to try to make the ice more rigid. And just to be a little provocative, Shinzen, I wonder if this might be where we all explore together, is there a level of complexity in certain systems, in certain educational systems? And I don't know your apps well enough to critique, but is there a way to simplify some of how we educate people to really get at the essence of it? And I say this as a clinician who's very little time with my patients, and they have very little patience with me in terms of like I'm suffering, I need some help. Are there ways that we might all work together, put our heads together to say, how do we refine this educational system to get at the heart of it, to help people provide that heat source themselves once they have felt the heat of the melting? And then, ultimately, going back to what Chelsey was talking about, how do we start to see what it feels like as we melt and flow together? And maybe even really taking the analogy a little too far, seeing what happens when that water evaporates. So I don't know if that's a kind of a good challenge for us to really say, okay, let's do this. Let's put our heads together. But that's kind of how I'm integrating this, and bringing that whole educational as well as experiential system together. And then, Shinzen, like you're pointing out, bring in these common elements that we can predict where somebody might run into a roadblock, and even bring in some AI to help those common roadblocks so that it can be more easily scaled.
I have to ask this
Wow.
question before we get off this call, which I feel like is concluding, because I'm just so curious. So I really want to know, Dr. Brewer, in your clinical work, we've talked about the self is multidimensional, and then we've talked about how you can target different brain areas to get to those different self states, but then how pretty much when you pull on one thread, it seems like the whole network just sort of starts to dissolve. And so it makes me think there's probably a ton of ways that people have pulled those threads for themselves without really knowing it. And I'm really wondering, in your work, have you found what kind of ways have you found that people start to access that besides meditation, maybe? And then secondly, what kind of effects do you see on people's relationships and on their integration just naturally? Like, what's reported when people say, oh, I had this no self state and now X changed? You just have this really amazing volume of clinical experience. I'd just love to know how that kind of works for your clients naturally.
Yeah. So really briefly, I tend not to use terms like self and no self, because it can get people locked into hardening, more rigidity as they're trying to figure out like what is self, or trying to force themselves into stream entry or something like that. Ironically, it freezes that block of ice even more. So here, I really just tap into the reward-based learning system, because that's relatively straightforward for everyone to understand, because we all have experiences of it, probably in the last 5-10 minutes. Like if a patient walks into my clinic, I could probably pinpoint with them, sometime when they were clinging or had aversion in the last 5 or 10 minutes, even sitting in the waiting room. And so everybody knows this experientially. And so I start there because they know that in their bones without concepts. They're like, oh yeah, that's what it feels like, whether it's a craving or, an aversion to something, and not even necessarily using the term aversion. So I actually start there, and then just help them explore what they get from holding on, what they get from pushing away, and this was actually the basis for some of our own apps that we developed around, everything from smoking to eating to anxiety, is really tapping into that reward-based learning system. Like, how rewarding is that really? And I might have mentioned before, we just published a paper with our Eat Right Now app, just having people pay attention as they overate. And it only took 10 or 15 times for them to realize that that was not rewarding. And so in that sense, that helps people see, oh, when I put energy into the system and make the ice more rigid, it's actually worse. It makes things worse. And then we have them pay attention as they overeat and see what it's like when they stop before they're full, for example. And they see that it's less painful. And so, oh, there's already, we've tapped into that reward-based learning system. And so I think that's 100% in alignment with what we're talking about here. But I just start with wherever somebody's at, whatever they're suffering from, we can bring awareness to that. We can help them see, if you take the Buddhist concept of dependent origination, we can help them see that through the simple lens of reinforcement learning, just mapping that out, and then bringing awareness in and helping them see that awareness itself helps melt the ice cube without having to do something. Instead of forcing themselves not to overeat, they can simply notice what it's like to overeat, become disenchanted, using the Buddhist terminology, and then also becoming enchanted with the letting go of overeating and bringing awareness in to meet their physiologic needs of, hunger, but not moving beyond that to the wants. I want more food, or the clean plate club, or whatever it is. So that's what I do from a pragmatic standpoint, but it really comes back to noticing, the contraction and the expansion, noticing the closeness that comes from wanting more, and noticing the openness that comes from simply being curious and aware. And I'll throw in kindness in particular as well, noticing what it's like when we're jerks to other people, noticing what it's like when we're kind, or when others are kind to us.
A kinder, gentler B.F. Skinner.
Yes.
Sorry, I couldn't resist that.
For sure.
But it is behavior. This is the good side of behaviorism. I mean, there was something to all of that. And the Buddha, one of his titles is Anuttaro Purisadhammasarati, which means the unexcelled trainer of the animal within the human. I take animal not to be a pejorative, like, oh, you're so primitive, but animal to be architectural layers. Yes.
Yeah.
We're training the part that still behaves like a reptile to be not just an intelligent social primate, but an angelic one.
I love that. May we all evaporate into angels.
On that note, thank you all so much. This has been just so fantastic. I think it might be productive maybe in 4 or 5 months to reconvene, perhaps sooner, and to see where the thinking and the work you're all doing together and separately has moved on this. So fascinating. I'll just end then by saying Shinzen Young, Chelsey Fasano, Dr. J. Sanguinetti, and very special guest returning, and to return again, I hope, Dr. Jud Brewer. Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.